Those of you that have been following my channel for a very long time, or have simply seen my most popular video ever, will know that I've made something like this before, but with the new remaster, a lot of my placements have shifted either due to time or due to changes. So, I'm just going to describe what each of the tiers mean right as soon as we get to that other screen, as well as why I'm doing the order that I decided to do. I should mention that I got this early review copy for free as to make this video. So, thank you, Paizo. And also, before we get super started, I just want to quickly mention a few changes that the remaster made. First one, spirit damage. Divine casters now have a reasonable, reliable damage cantrip in the form of Divine Lance, now dealing spirit damage. So it can hit anything that has a soul, which is most creatures. So if you are a Cleric, you now have a reasonable, reliable damage cantrip. Massive deal for Divine casters. Also, all magical traditions are just spell casting proficiency, not proficiency in each type of spells. So like if you have Bard and Arcane Sorcerer mixed together, they use the same spell proficiency because all your spells will be on one proficiency track. Really simple. Another major change is Aid. It is now DC 15 all levels, making it useful at the lower level tables. And Reposition exists. That doesn't really change any of my ratings, but does exist. Grappling became slightly easier. There's a bunch of other minor changes, but the main ones that will affect the rankings are Divine spells are now more consistent due to spirit damage being a thing. Aid is now overall a lower DC. That's really the class neutral things that will be affecting my rankings the most. Also, this list will be entirely focused on levels 1 through 5, because I think that's where a lot of new players will be playing, is at these lower levels. Because it is a complicated game, I would recommend starting at these lower levels, so that is really where I'm ranking the classes. So abilities that come online at higher levels are not really considered for this specific tier list. So, with that, let's just get started. Oh, and I should mention, C tier, still perfectly fine if that is the concept you want to play. If you want to play a character that has to unleash their full mental self and then has to reel back after, Psychic is the thing for that choice. It's still a very valid option if that is a concept that appeals to you. And so, what I am doing is I'm splitting everything to S, A, B, C, and D tiers. The reason being that everything in S tier I think is my personal favorite choices. A is really, really good. B, also good. C and D is where it starts to get a little bit sketchier. And D could specifically be renamed Slated for Rework, because that's really all that's going down to that tier. As a new player, you should be going with what makes you personally most engaged and happy. But I'm going to lay this out so that way you have a rough idea of the difficulty and the types of struggles that each class provides. In terms of ordering, I am starting with the 8 classes reprinted in Remaster 1, and then it'll be everything else after. Now, the classes that are planned to be reworked are actually going to be put down here, and that is the Oracle and the Alchemist. These are the 2 that are slated for major reworks coming up, and they also have some pretty big power level concerns right now. Like, Alchemist is infamous for being a character that can prep things midday based on the list that they have had to prep and be managing before then, and can actually run out of their ability to use their primary class features very, very heavily, which is a pretty rare trait, because like at least spellcasters have focus spells and cantrips to lean back on. Alchemist doesn't have anything like that. So a lot of people that are new and want to pick up an Alchemist kind of get to the point where they're like, okay, now I'm completely out of items, and that happens especially often at the low levels. So it really is something that you'd want to have a lot of game knowledge for in order to utilize, and also requires team synergy. Oracle's in a similar boat where you do have cantrips and focus spells, but a lot of the curses are way more of hindrances than they are helps, which puts them at a lower power level than the other casters in the game currently. Unless you are playing very specific curses, such as Life or Cosmos, these 2 are going down here as the 2 I would avoid, and they are going to be getting a rework when Core 2 comes out. So, with that, let's go over all of the Player Core 1 classes. And let's start with the Bard. The Bard had some minor quality of life changes, which is something you'll hear me say a lot throughout this. Notably, with all bards now have access to martial weapons, so you can actually pick the weapon that best suits your character without needing to be a warrior muse. And if you are warrior muse, you then have another benefit on your striking, letting you extend the duration of Inspire Courage for one more round, once per casting, blah blah blah. But that's effectively what you should expect from a bard. I know they also renamed a bunch of the composition cantrips, like Inspire Courage is one that got renamed. I'm going to put the new version on the screen right now because I don't remember off the top of my head. But they changed a lot of the names around. They changed some things like Inspire Defense now no longer requires you to be Maestro Muse. And there are other things you can do with composition cantrips and other ways that knowledge can be more useful, specifically with a level 4 feat that really likes you to have occultism. And lets you get a weirder version of recall knowledge with occultism on any creature. So a lot of very cool things for other types of bard that aren't just, I'm going to linger some kind of composition cantrip and do my thing. That type bard is still just as good as always. But now I think there are other things for bard that increased its build variety a lot. So I really like the changes to bard. It is going to be top of A tier, and it's going to be my gatekeeper before things go into S. And that's about all I have to say for the bard. Pick it if you want to have a good occult caster with a lot of variety of the things it does outside of its normal spellcasting. So bards heavily lean on all the charisma skills and their composition cantrips to really flow them together and get through things. You will feel like you never have enough actions to do anything by design, because you will have like 5 things you want to do and only 3 actions to put them in. So with that, I'm going to put bard in A tier because it does not starve you of choice. But if you don't want to learn what all the charisma skill actions do, that could be an issue. But otherwise, incredible choice if you want to play spellcaster, particularly in the more supporty ones. Cleric got some, I would say, minor boost for feats, except for the things that they did to their font. Their font change, actually massive. Clerics no longer need to rely on charisma. Because previously, their font was, you would get extra heals or harms based on 1 plus your charisma. And those would be max rank spell slots of heal or harm. And now, for clerics, they just get 4, 5, or 6, depending on how high their charisma would be at those levels. So, massive buff, massive amount of build variety that opened up. And they also have the ability to get heavy armor without needing to multiclass if you're a War Priest, which is very, very massive deal. I'm going to drop them into S tier. If you are a new player and your group needs a healer, you can pick Cleric. They give you so much healing baseline, you won't really need to worry about it. And then you can experiment with your spell slots and decide what you want to do without feeling like you need to prepare a bunch of heals as a prepared caster. So, bam, straight into S tier. Druids, as far as I could tell, really only had one big change that affects them in the lower levels. And that is, of course, the fact that they can now use metal armor and weaponry. Which does increase the build variety, makes it a lot easier to play strength druid at the early levels. But otherwise, they seem to be pretty similar overall, to me at least. Maybe a few extra bits and bobs there, like Storm Druid got some new toys that can manipulate the environment. But I really liked Druid before, really like Druid now. Not a whole lot changed, because not a lot need to change. They just have metal armor, so there aren't any arguments about, hey, GM, could I have a suit of breastplate armor, but it's made out of, like, thickened wood that does it? You can just wear whatever armor you want. Metal is now one of the natural planes. So, you can go ahead and use metal armor. Easy. Yeah, that's enough to put an A. Fighter, I would say, is probably one of the most satisfying martial classes to actually play. And as such, it's going to get put in S tier, right next to Cleric. These two swap around depending on what your party really needs. You pick a fighter because you want to have high accuracy and you want to fight things. It also stops people from being able to run away as easily, so that's very nice. Other good things about fighter is when you're picking out your fighting style, you can be a polearm user that can then throw off reactive strikes when people try to run at or away from you. You can go ahead and dual wield to try and have as high damage output as possible. You can build them as like a grappler or duelist. There's a lot of ways to build a fighter. Basically all of them are good. It's just the premier martial class. And whatever you decide to do with a fighter, you can do it, and it will be fun. And that's enough for me to put it as my S tier martial, to go along with my S tier cast of Cleric. My 2 favorite picks. Now, Ranger, you will have that little action economy issue of Hunt Prey. However, they made it so that crossbows are super satisfying. There's a feat to have you combine that reload action with them very early on at level 1, so that you can then take cover as you're reloading. So it encourages you to play around cover, do all that kind of stuff. Then maybe be able to hide and pop out as hiding and do all that kind of cool stuff. So Precision Crossbow Ranger just got a lot better. Otherwise, Rangers seem to get a few new toys around, like, some focus spells, but for the low levels, nothing really changed that much, except for now martial crossbows are more of a thing. Crossbow Ace does better things. And that's really all they needed. So, yeah. Now with Rogue, they did give all rogues access to all martial weapons, which, really good, means that they can start using some of the Treasure Vault weapons or some of the weirder weapons that came out in later source books, and also now rogues can actually use shurikens without needing to multi-class, which was a whole thing that frustrated me before, very heavily. Now they don't need to deal with that, so you can pick whatever weapon you want, as long as you know how to get somebody flat-footed. Great pick. Put them in A tier. Like, they did also rework what Ruffian is doing. Now it works with martial weapons of damage die up to D6, which, pretty solid change in my mind, because that's usually one-handed, weirder martial weapons, which I'm happy they now have a home on somebody's build. So that means a rogue Ruffian can go through with, like, a whip and high strength and have a great time. You can then go through with even something like a Flick Mace. You can now have a Flick Mace Ruffian rogue, and do some very, very interesting things there. So they open up a lot of build variety for the strength rogue side of things, and for the dexterity rogue side of things, they now have more weapon variety. So that's really what the remaster gave to rogue. I liked rogue before. I just will note that if you're going to play a ranged rogue, you will likely come to issues trying to get sneak attack off consistently. So if you are a brand new player, I'd recommend keeping your rogues in melee to where you can get easy access to flanking or feinting. Witch was one of the classes that got a major rework in the remaster. A lot of the other classes I said they nudged a little bit. Witch in the previous tier list was like here. Now, I can put it up here with everybody else in the remaster. Because what they did is they actually made it so that the patron feels like it matters more. They made it so that the focus spells you get from Witch are more impactful. They made it so that the familiar is more impactful and does something that is unique to the Witch that you can't even archetype into getting. Thus giving it a lot more things you can be doing. So it gets to hang out in A tier now, because it has a legitimate niche. It fills a really interesting story element. It has very evocative feats, and it focuses on being a caster. But that's kind of what people would expect from a Witch. It does what I would expect from the class to do. And that alone is enough for me to put in A tier. It had a bunch of other reworks and feats. However, me just reading off the list of changes to Witch could be its own video, because it was that big of a shift. But really, they shifted it to be what I feel like Witch should have been the whole time. And I review the Witch rework very highly. I need to see more how it plays in practice, and hear more stories about people playing with the new Witch, in order for me to fully say any criticism I have with it. But on first parse through, love the class. It's now on my list of things to play, along with everything else in the game. Wizard, a lot of people kind of made a stink going in about, they took away all the power from the spell schools, and I mean, sure, but you still have pretty solid lists of things and ways for your GM to add on more spells if you work with them, and I think that a lot of GMs will be pretty open to being worked with in that way. For Pathfinder Society, that will likely be an issue, particularly if you're trying to make use of those lower level slots. But, or lower rank slots, I should say. Gotta use the remaster terminology now. The thing about Wizard as it is right now is that it has a lot of interesting feats still. It has a bunch of extra slots, still has Drain Bond item. Like, it has more slots per day than any other prepared caster. And that alone is enough to make it a really, really good class. I think that people saying Wizard is dead now because of these changes, it's like, they took away a little bit of its utility at upper levels, unless you are the subclass that lets you destroy lower level slots, or lower rank slots to get higher rank slots. Like, I think Wizard is fine, entirely. I thought Wizard was fine before, I think it's fine now, and I will note that if you pick spells that don't do much as a wizard, or you make some errors in your book and spell preparation, Wizard can be weaker. However, honestly, that's the only issue with the class you'll have as a new player. If you look up a guide to spells post-remaster, which I will get working on over the next couple weeks, it will be really, really fun, and honestly, if you want to just have a caster with not a whole lot of bells and whistles, that is the thing you should play. But as it leans so heavily into its spells, and you can pick a bunch of spells that are not the most useful for your adventure, I'm going to put it in B tier. But just know that if you do the spell preparation thing right, it very well competes with everything else. All the classes are balanced around when played well. They are equally powerful. It's just that Wizard has a bit higher of a bump for you to go up, which doesn't lean as hard on its spells, so it gets to be that one little tier tick higher. But, yeah, that's how it goes. Barbarian, glass cannon martial in this game. They're not really a tank like you could expect coming from 5e. They're all about how hard they can hit people, and they have that HP only so that they can take the hit back after they drop their AC to hit you harder. That being said, big number go burr. If you like big number going burr, pick a Barbarian. For more detail, they haven't been reworked in any way. Their main gimmick is be really strong, hit stuff really hard. That's why you're picking Barbarian. If your goal is to not play somebody that is just getting in there and hitting stuff ridiculously hard, then Barbarian isn't the class for you. But in terms of super satisfying martials, Giant Instinct Barbarian's damage numbers, oh boy, they get that lizard brain firing. Champion, aka if you hit my friends, you need to deal with me. Also, gets to go up to like here. Because, well, it has a little bit of healing for out of combat. In combat, you just need to be constantly positioning and trying to get value out of your champion reaction. So position becomes a little bit important. And this is particularly true if you are the paladin, you don't have a reach weapon, or the feat that lets you step and strike as part of your retributive strike. So you are really going to want to position near your allies and try to have everything being like a tight death ball, and then people will be wanting to either hit you, or they need to eat your reaction. And champion reaction is one of the most infamously powerful things in the game. Yes, it is unlimited use. A lot of new players are completely blindsided by that. So Gunslinger, I'm going to put it in B tier, not because I think the class is weak, but because I don't think it does what a lot of new players would come in expecting it to do, because a lot of new players come in and expect it to be a super high damage class, when what they end up getting is a utility crit fishing character. Because a lot of guns have the Fatal trait, and Fatal really only works on crits, and so Gunslinger expects you to be using a lot of skill actions and positioning and such to set yourself up to get these crits. And so it can be very unsatisfying if you are not trying to explicitly play the class in the way that it wants you to. And as such, that's why I'm putting it down in a little bit of a lower tier. That's just how it's going to go. If you do want to play a crit fishing type character, Gunslinger is absolutely the class for you. They have a lot of other utility in their kit. However, their kit is not focused on consistent high damage output. That's where things like the Fighter, the Barbarian, the Ranger, and the Rogue come in. Inventor, it's going to go at bottom of A because a lot of new players are maybe a little bit confused by what its feats do, but if you expect to go in there and play some guy with a really weird weapon that then gets pulled up to do extra damage, that's exactly what you get. And sometimes they just explode for area damage. They're the little bit of everything class that came out before Kineticist. I really like them, and if you are a new player, just make sure that you have a 16 in your attacking stat, whether that be strength or dex, and then 18 in your int, and you will be fine. That's really all you need to make Inventor work. And yeah, that's it. Now, Investigator, I'm going to put into a lower B tier because it involves heavily playing its little minigame. If you do not really want to play the Investigator minigame of, I am going to be doing these leads, and then I'm going to be devising my stratagem, and then figuring out what I'm going to do based on the devised stratagem, you will dislike this class. And instead, I'd recommend playing a rogue that you then say is an Investigator. Because Investigator is all about gaining information, and its primary mechanic in combat is to roll a d20, and then know, okay, so if I attack that guy next, I'll use this roll. You can still shoot other people, you can do other things, but as Investigator, you do end up having a little bit of a hard time if you don't have plans for, what do I do when that number rolls low in a boss fight? And knowing how to fill that gap is what keeps it out of, like, the A tier, and to the point of it being a really good class for new players, because it does require system mastery to know how to fill that void. And the reason Investigator was originally printed in the Advanced Player's Guide is because they knew that is a difficult void to fill. So, Investigator goes here, because as a newer player, I know a lot of them tend to struggle with that minigame and the little nuances around it. Kineticist, I'm going to be moving to the top of A tier, because Kineticist, as some other people claimed, to be one of the hardest classes in the game. I don't necessarily believe them. It does require a bit more learning and a bit more knowledge to get the character made and have the player understand, okay, so I need to channel my thing and then I can start doing my elemental blast stuff. But after you understand that, a lot of Kineticist just makes sense. I'd recommend that if you're building Kineticist for the first time, make sure you have that 18 con, or plus 4 bonus in con, and just be. Like, take 2 elements that you like, take a cool feat from each, and that'll open up your pool enough to the point where if you're like, I don't really like this thing, you then have a wide enough array of options that you can pivot within the same character, and you can then be dipping water for a little bit of healing, go into fire for some area damage, go into earth for some tankiness. It's great time. Love Kineticist as a class. I think that's a great spot for new players. Magus, however, I'm going to be putting in B tier for the same reasons as Investigator. It has a little minigame involving Spell Strike. And if you are not thinking about how I can best manipulate Spell Strike, how I'm going to be in position to get off this thing, as well as learning the spells, as well as learning how to play a martial, it requires you to have a lot of knowledge coming into it, and then figure out what you want to be doing with the Spell Strike and doing all this other stuff. I would say that when you put in moving and being positioning as a melee into the equation, it becomes very, very difficult. But if you want to just play like a ranged magical blaster, Magus and Kineticist are probably 2 best classes to do that, because with the bow Magus specifically, you have a very, very easy time just dealing damage from range with magical attacks. And sometimes that's exactly what somebody wants as a newer player, is some kind of cool archer that puts magic on arrows. And that's what Magus is great for. And I think that the range version of Magus, really simple, because you're effectively just shooting, recharging Spell Strike, and then getting ready to shoot again the next turn. Really easy. Monk, I previously put down in a mid-tier, simply because it's hard to figure out what to fill that third action with. Now I feel pretty safe putting it up here, because now it's move, flurry of blows, and aid, because aid was recently changed to be only DC 15, making it a very accessible thing for lower level characters. So now a level 1 monk could actually go for an aid with athletics or an aid with something in order to help their allies also hit the other guy. And that is enough of a general filler into their action economy to make it so that I have a couple actions I don't know what to do with, stops being as much of an issue, because now aid is just a perfect answer for them. And now you don't need to be thinking character creation when making a monk of how am I going to spend this third action on every given turn, because you then have the ability to pull out items, use them, and then also aid. And that is enough for me to dink it up a tier just from a neutral system change. Psychic, I think I'm going to put it down in, like, C tier, because the thing with Psychic is you need to understand the occult spell list, then you need to understand the modifications that Psychic does, including how it modified the actual text of the cantrips, what the amps are, what exactly each instance of damage is for your whole Unleash Psyche thing, managing the 2 subclasses that you have, as well as being a squishy caster with some melee abilities potentially if you are the specific subclass that want to do it. And asks a lot of questions of you repeatedly. And it's all just there to be a class that you will then have to spend time into learning, spend effort into mastering, and then it will reward you back. It also has a weak levels like 1 through 4, which is mostly how I'm rating these things, because it takes a little while for its Unleash Psyche damage to actually start scaling. It takes a while for its focus spells to actually start scaling. It's just kind of that rough early game, plus difficult to learn, makes me put it lower than a lot of the other classes. Sorcerer is the no-frills charisma caster. If you just want to try out playing a mage, Sorcerer just gives you a bunch of slots to play with. That's its main class gimmick. It's probably going to get a little bit of a touch-up in Core 2, because I think that some of its focus spells are a little unsatisfying right now. But if you're a new player and you just want to try out being a caster, Spontaneous is also a bit more forgiving than Prepared. I just like Sorcerer as a whole for a class for a new player. I don't really have a whole lot to add. It's a caster. It's exactly what you'd expect. Alright. And now we're on to Summoner, which I'm going to slap right next to Psychic for similar reasons of very difficult to really wrap your head around as a newer player, because it has a whole lot of weird things with, okay, so I have one combination thing where I'm able to move my Summoner and my Eidolon, but only one of them can do a 2-action activity when I'm doing this, so that means I'm having this weird thing, but I'm not quite a 4-action split across 2 bodies. It's that, plus, if you look on Archives and Methods for Summoner, you can see just like a massive amount of text to deal with all the edge cases that come from one player controlling 2 characters. As a newer player, I do not really recommend immediately jumping for Summoner, because, and I should mention, Summoner is, you have one pet that fights alongside you effectively. It is not summon an army of things and run to battle with them. It's, I have my spirit best friend stand that is going to go beat the shit out of you, or Aura style. It's not the, I'm going to summon an army and overwhelm them. Okay. And now we have Swashbuckler, which I'm also going to put in B tier, because it requires you to really know how to play its minigame. So I'm going to put the other minigame classes. And with Swashbuckler, you need to be using its specific actions that it likes, such as Tumble Through, Bon Mot, Feint. It depends on what subclass you are, the action that you need to be using. But with a lot of them, you're kind of locked into, okay, so I need to get Panache, I need to figure out when the best time to spend it, and it's a lot of timing-oriented things. It's very, very satisfying to play well. However, as a new player, it might be overwhelming to need to worry about your strikes, as well as the timings of all these other abilities. So, it's just hanging on B tier. And Thaumaturge, final one to rank. It's either top of B, bottom of A. Like, I'm going to put right next to Inventor, because I think they're pretty similar of, you get extra damage by doing a skill check on somebody. As long as your other stat is a 16, you're probably going to be fine. You have a lot of good recall knowledge utility. It's a weird class, but if you actually read it and understand it, it is super satisfying, and honestly, not the worst pick for a new player. So yeah, this is my final list. And that's all I have for you today. Be on the lookout for my video about the best low-level spells in the remaster. I'm not sure how much will have changed from my previous list, but yeah. That's it.